Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure and the honor to welcome you to Sutter Instrument's first webinar, Scientists Empowering Scientists. Today we will talk about learning how to make better pipettes. My name is Jan and I'm a pipette junkie. I started as a user of glass micropipettes at university in Germany, then joined Axon Instruments and stayed there through several mergers, joined Sutter Instrument in 2011, went to HIC Electronic, and since 2014 I'm back at Sutter Instrument. The agenda for the webinar today, I will give you a few introductory remarks. Most of that will be housekeeping items, and then I will talk a little bit about latest or more recent products, what's new, what new products did we release over the last several years. Then Adair Oesterle will talk about optimizing settings on your Sutter micropipette puller. She will teach you how to make better pipettes. Telly Galiatsatos will moderate the question and answer session, and when you close the webinar, you will be directed to a short survey that's mostly about what could we have made better today. Did the timing work for you? We realize it's pretty difficult to schedule a webinar at a time that works for a worldwide customer base. So your feedback is very important. For us, we restricted it to just a few questions. Please take this time to answer them. If you do not have audio, well then you don't hear me now, so I'll leave this slide a little longer than the others, because we have dial-in numbers, international dial-in numbers, and you will need the access code in the bottom. So if you cannot hear me, dial in. If you have any questions, in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right of your screen, this is the Mac version. The Windows version will look a little bit different. You have a questions section, so please use the Q&A section in the session control panel. You may want to indicate in case there's questions for me for my introduction, or for Adair if that's not completely clear. And all questions will be addressed either during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, or if we don't find the time, if there are too many questions, and considering the number of registrants, I would expect there are quite a few questions, they will be addressed offline by email. The most frequently asked question during the registration was, will this webinar be available offline? Yes, it will. We are recording this event. We are also having a second session later today. That's for those of us who are not early birds, who like watching a webinar in the evening, and also for our customers in Asia. The recording for those who can't attend either event will be available at our YouTube channel, and we expect that to be online within the next 2 weeks. This is our first webinar, so we may or may not have to edit the recording. That's why I don't want to commit, but I would think the next 2 weeks are definitely realistic. You will be notified, everybody who's registered for the webinar will be notified that the recording is online. Slides of this presentation are available on request for non-commercial use, for teaching purposes, etc., etc. So let me switch to the recent product introductions. What's new? First and foremost, the Quad 4-axis micromanipulator. The system, I want to highlight mostly the ease of pipette changes using the user-programmable home and work positions. We also have YouTube videos about that, and also the diagonal swing gate helps with that. Besides that, there's a multicolor display that indicates the mode of operation. So, for example, when it's in quiet, in pause mode, or in relative mode. There's no fan to blow dust over your airtable, or the pulse mode also facilitates intracellular recordings, impaling the cell. And of course, there's the usual sort of features like a high repeatability, small resolution, etc. What you will like is the price point. The Quad, compared to an MPC 325 manipulator system, is roughly the same price, or maybe even exactly the same price. It's not right for everyone though. The quad is one mechanical per controller. That means it's easily set up and configured, but the MPC 200 based manipulator systems let you control up to 4 mechanicals with one ROE, one rotary optical encoder unit, and that gives you the maximal versatility in complex bespoke rigs in more complex applications. The quad can only be controlled using the ROE, whereas MPC 200 based systems, and that is not only manipulators but also moving platform stages, motorized platform stages, and the SOM and MOM microscopes, they can either be controlled using an ROE or computer control. So that makes for better integration in sophisticated setups. Another new product, we found that amazingly many people do not know that we also have LED light sources and have had them for quite a few years. Started with the TLED and TLED Plus light sources, and an LED light source obviously has faster on-off times than many other light sources. That makes for faster multi-channel acquisition. The life expectancy is in excess of 50,000 hours. Quickly did the math a while ago and came up with a figure, if you use it about 8 hours a day or something like that, it will outlast your research life, depending on your age, and probably even most of your postdocs. Definitely will last as long as the microscope, much longer than the conventional lamps. And they're adaptable to all major microscopes. In many cases, it's even a drop-in replacement for a conventional lamp. Differences between the two: the TLED has a lower current output, 1 amp. It comes in various wavelengths and color temperatures, white temperatures. The TLED Plus has 5 amps, comes in fewer wavelengths. That's simply because of the availability of the LEDs. It has an input for analog modulation and directly communicates with Nikon's TI hub. TLED Plus also comes in a dual channel version for more advanced applications if you need to quickly switch between 2 wavelengths. And again, this is adaptable to all major microscopes. Shown here is our own SOM microscope. The high-power LED light sources were launched more recently, the HPX and the L5, either with liquid cooling or with liquid light guide technology. They both obviously are vibration-free because there's no vibration transmitted to your microscope. Can be controlled using current or pulse width modulation dimming. That allows easy integration in acquisition systems. The on-off times are even faster than with the TLED. And yeah, the life expectancy, of course, and it can be adapted to all major microscopes. A while ago, we introduced a number of electrophysiology bundles. And I just briefly want to show them here. The Alcatraz is a bundle with a fixed stage, manipulators on top of that fixed stage, and a microscope translator. And the microscope obviously is not included here. The San Francisco bundle consists of a microscope translator and gantry stands as opposed to a fixed stage, also a stand for the recording chamber here. And the Long Island Electrophysiology Bundle is a motorized stage with manipulators, and both stage and manipulators can be controlled using a single ROE unit, a single ROE 200, with MPC 200 systems that can either be daisy-chained or it can also be controlled by software. We support a number of common microscopes like the Zeiss Axio Examiner, the Leica DM6000FS, the Olympus BX51WI, or the Nikon FM1. A bundle more recently introduced is the In Vivo bundle, here shown with a SOM and 1 quad unit. It even includes a P1000 puller. And as a serving suggestion, you could add a second quad unit, and obviously the whole thing will be mounted either on a breadboard or on an Airtable. I'll get to that in a second. What benefits do bundles have for you? The configurations that we offer were developed by reputable labs. That means they are proven to produce results. Do not misunderstand that as guaranteed to produce results, and no, the bundle will not write the paper for you, but it'll make for a much shorter setup time. You can control all components of the bundles that we have here through a single ROE input device, except for the in vivo bundle, obviously. There's a simple USB interface for easy software control through either Sutter's multi-link software, by the way, free to download on our website, or open source commands. And of course, there's a certain price advantage of a bundle as opposed to buying individual components. Most recently, and hot off the press, so hot off the press, in fact, that you won't even find it on our website or in our catalog yet, but we'll bring it in the catalog for next year, is Airtables. We added Airtables to our product portfolio, and here is what most of you will probably use, or many of you will probably use, a workstation for either electrophysiology or microinjections. And for our mom customers, we also offer optical tables now. As I said, not even on the website yet, but if you are in the market for an Airtable right now, let us know, and we're happy to get you a quote with more detailed description about the models that are available. Many of in the audience today will want to buy an Airtable with a Faraday cage, as shown here, and that gets us a step closer to our goal of providing turnkey systems. If you bundle an Airtable with, for example, an in vivo bundle, then you have almost a complete system there. Our goal is to provide you as complete a system as it gets. Let me switch gears. A pre-announcement, save the date. This webinar is part of the series Scientists Empowering Scientists, and what we also have is user meetings. We started at Biophysics in Baltimore earlier this year, and the second user meeting will be on Monday, October 19th at 6:30 Central Time, and will take place in or around the Chicago Convention Center. As soon as we hear from the Society for Neuroscience where exactly the venue is going to be, we expect that to be within the next month or two, we will send out another e-blast, so stay tuned, and then the registration will open. Save the date, Monday, October 19th. That's the Monday during the Society for Neuroscience conference. I'm required to mention that the event is not sponsored by the Society. Today's presenters, who's going to talk today? As I mentioned, Telly Galiatsatos will moderate the question and answer session. Telly graduated in computer science in 1987 and joined Instratech. And in 2007, when Instratech was acquired by Hika Electronic, he became the general manager for Hika Instruments. And I'm very pleased that Telly earlier this year joined Sutter Instrument. And the long-awaited star of today, Adair Oesterle. Many of you will have interacted with her either by email, on the phone, or at a trade show, or at some summer school, and will have heard her teach about making pipettes. But repetition never hurts, because adults learn by repetition. Let me say that again, adults learn by repetition. Adair will teach you how to make better pipettes today. She graduated at Scripps, majored in biology, and then went through UCSB and San Francisco State in postgrad studies, worked as a research biologist at the San Francisco VA Medical Center, at UCSF, and then again at the VA Medical Center. And since 1998, Adair is with Sutter Instrument, and today she's the applications engineer and product manager for the filament-based micropipette pullers. Filament-based, as a reminder for myself, to mention that What we will focus today is valid for the filament-based pullers, but many of the principles that Adair will talk about can also be transferred to the P2000 laser-based micropipette puller. The values, the program values will be slightly different, but the principles still apply. So I will now turn the presentation over to Adair.
Okay, this is Adair Oesterle, and the first thing I'm going to do here is go over what we're going to discuss today. We're going to look at the different pullers we have and the applications, look at pipette morphology, discuss the parameter settings of the puller, look at the features of the P1000 puller. We're going to discuss the filament and glass alignment. This is very important. If you don't have this, the filament properly positioned over the air jet or the glass properly positioned in the filament, all bets are off as to whether or not your parameter settings are going to work very well and you're going to get consistent pipettes. To show you how to write a stable program and how to go about adjusting the parameter settings and how to avoid making those ugly pipettes. Here's our P1000 pipette puller with the touchscreen display. Isn't she pretty? And here's our older models, the P97 and the P87 pullers. If you have a P1000, older puller that does not have the nitrogen tank, that does have a nitrogen tank, you have a very old puller. And so this has a dry write canister here. And also the P87 has that too. If your pullers have a nitrogen tank, it's very old and might be ready for the Smithsonian. The P1000, here are the new features to the puller. We do have, the P1000 has the same features as the P97 plus these additional features. It has a touchscreen display as I described. It has a Pipette Cookbook directory where you can look up programs, install them, and then get working with making a good stable program from the basis of the program that was provided in the cookbook. The ramp test value is associated with the program, which is really nice because I usually forget what the ramp test value is the moment I press reset on the P97 puller, and I forget to write it down. So it's nice that it's embedded into the program. There's a safe heat mode. This is nice too. It keeps you from burning out the filament, also referred to as effing up the filament. You don't want to do that, and so the safe heat mode prevents you from putting in heat settings that are way too low or way too high. Settings that are too low are also somewhat dangerous to the puller. You can cause a little bit of a meltdown on the nylon backing there of the brass jaws, so you want to avoid that. I call that a Salvador Dali event, with the meltdown. There's a temperature sensor on the filament jaws, and that's another variable to look at when you're pulling your pipettes. Nice to know, say your pipettes are turning out perfect when the jaws are at 45 to 65 degrees centigrade. That's something to follow. This puller also has diagnostics, a little bit of a smarter puller than the previous pullers we've had, so you can test to see if the heat pull velocity and the air cooling are working properly in your puller. And then it's got this preheat mode where you can preheat the jaws, and that's really nice because you can pull your pipettes all at the same temperature, and that helps prevent some variability you might be running into. So here's an age-old question here, does size matter? And keep in mind we're talking about pipettes. And the answer is yes. And depending on if you're micro-injecting zebrafish or you might be doing micro-injection of mouse eggs, doing transgenics and putting DNA or RNA into the cytoplasm or into the nucleus, you need a specific shape pipette for that to work. So the application is going to determine the pipette morphology. And so whether you're doing dissociated patch recording where you need a short little stubby pipette, isn't that pretty? And then if you're doing slice patch recording, you need something more gradual, a little bit slender, a little longer to reach through the tissue and get to the cells. You're going to need something like this, usually using thin wall glass to maintain a nice opening of your pipette. You can see right here, even though I've pulled the pipette long, the opening's still about 1 or 2 microns here. And then if you're doing adherent cell microinjection or you're doing pronuclear injection, you're going to need a more slender pipette and even a longer, more gradual taper if you're going deep into the egg here. So you need something nice and long. So when you penetrate through the zona and the plasma membrane, you're not causing a big hole inside here and causing the eggs to lyse. Here's a Pipette Cookbook, something we've had out for a while. It comes with every puller. And in the P1000, we've actually installed the parameter set, the cookbook programs. So you can go to the cookbook menu. You can tell the puller which filament you have installed, which glass you're using, what application you're doing, and it kicks out a program. You can dial it into wherever you want to install it and hopefully get rocking and rolling and making your pipettes. There are various parameter settings here to control how the glass is pulled on your puller. There's 5 parameter settings. There's heat, pull, velocity, time delay, and pressure. So let's first go through these parameter settings so we all understand what they do. The heat is the amount of current delivered to the filament. It's not the temperature of the jaws or temperature of the filament. It's the amount of current you're providing. And there's a picture there of the filament being heated up, melting the glass. But what value do we put in for the heat? The range is 0 to 999, and you can put in a variety of values here, and you don't want to call your friend in another lab and say, hey, what are you using? And they give you a value that's super high, and you might end up burning out your filament. So the type of filament you have in your puller and the size is going to determine what heat setting to use. And so you might have a box filament here on the left or a trough filament there on the right. And also the size of the glass you're using, the OD and ID of your glass, and also the type of glass is going to determine what heat setting to use. So there's examples of thick-walled or standard-walled glass and also thin-walled glass. So what you want to do is you want to run a ramp test. You don't want to call your buddy in another lab and he gives you a value that's way too high and you burn out your filament and then you start cussing like a sailor. So you need to run a ramp test. You're going to, what the ramp test does in the puller is it gradually increases the current through the filament until the glass softens. The puller bars start to drift apart. There's a velocity transducer inside that picks up on that movement. And this gives this amount of heat that's required to soften the glass is your ramp value, and that's displayed on the front panel on the display. And this is a safe heat to start with. It's also a really good stable heat to start with. It's very efficient. If you use something way over the ramp value or way under the ramp value, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to run into variability. So again, this is a stable heat to use. The ramp test is going to show you here what happens. The filament gets brighter and brighter. Finally, it's hot enough to soften the glass. The glass will not separate. You'll just get a little hourglass bend in the glass there, or melt. And then you can put that value in for your heat and start pulling your pipettes. So your heat value is determined by the ramp test value, and in the P1000, you can install that exact value in for your heat. And there's that safe heat mode there that keeps you from putting in a value that's too high. Here's an example of a value that's too high. It's 10% over the ramp test value, and you'll get a warning that tells you, hey, don't do this, you might burn out your filament. And so that's a nice safety feature. The other parameter setting here to discuss is the pull. And there's a pull solenoid inside that when you give it current, it engages and it pulls down on this plunger that's right here. When the puller bars are pulled together, the plunger is right up here. And then when the puller bars start to drift apart as the glass softens, this goes down a little bit. And then if you have a hard pull installed, this plunger gets pulled down by the magnet and creates the hard pull and pulls out your pipettes nice and sharp and pointy. So the hard pull is the amount of current you're providing to the pull solenoid. Patch pipettes normally have 0 pull. You still have the weight of that plunger there that's giving you gravitational kind of weighted pull, but you have usually 0 pull with making patch pipettes because you want a short taper. And the sharp electrodes, you're going to have a moderate pull in there, 60 to 150. I usually don't go higher than that, or I end up overwhelming the parameter settings. There's a velocity transducer inside that picks up on the movement of the puller bars as they start to drift apart. And that's a direct correlation to the viscosity of the glass. That's how we're figuring out what's going on with the glass, is that velocity transducer. It's quite sophisticated. The velocity is your trip point for turning the heat off and starting the cooling. You have a high velocity, the puller bars run away, the glass drifts apart pretty far. and then it's a trip point for turning the heat off. So you're going to have a longer taper and a smaller tip with higher velocity. And if you're making sharp electrodes, usually have something between 65 to 90 with your velocity setting. I usually like to stick around 70, 75. Your velocity range for patch pipettes is going to vary depending on if you're making a short taper or a gradual taper. The cooling is determined, is provided by two modes, time and delay. I'm going to go over this in detail, but the time, it gives you a little less cooling than the delay mode. The delay mode gives you 300 milliseconds of cooling total right down here. Where the time mode, you have a little less. You have about half of that available. So I really prefer the delay mode for most applications. And we'll get back to that in a second. The pressure is the amount of PSI cooling your filament and your glass. The more pressure, the harder you're blowing on the glass, the shorter the taper, and the larger the tip. Okay, let's go through the time mode here. The heat turns on when you're using the time mode, and the glass softens. The velocity transducer picks up on the movement, and then you turn off the heat, and you turn on the cooling, and for the duration that you installed, and then you engage the hard pull, and that all happens pretty much simultaneously. In the delay mode, the heat turns on, the glass softens just like before, the velocity transducer picks up on that movement, trip point, turns off the heat, starts that cooling. So then what happens here is you're delaying the hard pull. So you're not engaging the hard pull at the same time, it happens afterwards. So in this situation, what you can do is you can determine how viscous that glass is when you yank on it and pull on it. So if I have that 300 milliseconds of cooling, that's what I'm going to get no matter what, but I'm determining when I'm pulling on that glass. So if I pull at 60 milliseconds, I'm going to get a nice taper here and a nice little tip. But say I want a little shorter. I want to delay that pull a little bit more so the glass is more viscous, it's cooled down a little bit more, so then it pulls out a little shorter. And then I can go even further and I can throw in a very high delay, get that glass really viscous, and pull out a more stubby kind of sharp pipette. Now I can go too far and put a delay in that's too high, and glass won't pull in one stage. So that's when you know you've gone too far, your program's not behaving properly. Why would I use a delay mode with making patch pipettes? Well, I want to do that because I've got a fixed 300 milliseconds of cooling. I'm going to provide more cooling to that glass than the time mode. I'm going to have more control over the viscosity of the glass. I'm going to have shorter tapers. I'm going to have larger tips if I want lower resistances. And that's a huge advantage. So when do I use a delay mode? To review this again, it's when you've got when you're using thick wall glass, a box filament, you're making those patch pipettes. And when I'm making sharp electrodes, and I don't want that pipette to be so long and so wispy. And it's also more of a sophisticated way of controlling the glass when you're pulling it. Here's a Pipette Cookbook. Here's one of the example pages in here about how to install a filament. And there's a YouTube video that we have called Installing a Filament. It's about 2.5 minutes long. Not long enough to enjoy popcorn and beer, but long enough to short enough to not fall asleep, and hopefully give you some helpful hints about how to install that filament. This is very important. If your filament's not installed properly, you're really not going to get good results with your parameter settings, no matter what you do. So I'm going to go over this in some detail here. Here's your air jet. That's where the air is coming out to cool the glass and the filament. And then here is this raised part of brass right here on this air jet. You want the filament perfectly centered over that hole. And when it's perfectly centered over the hole, you have an equal amount of raised brass on both sides of the filament. Look at that. That's what you want to aim for. You might need your reading glasses. You might need a flashlight. You might need to look real close and really examine it, but that is extremely important. If that filament is off by 200 microns off to one side or another, you're really going to run into some problems. So here's an example. What you need to do, let me go right back for a second. Here's this program you want to put in. It's going to pull a long tapered pipette. And this is in page 17 in the cookbook. You're going to pull a long tapered pipette even if you don't want that, even if you're making patch pipettes. But you have to do this to accentuate what's going on with the cooling and the heating. and determine whether or not the tapers on the right and left are the same length. If you pull a patch pipette, it's too short to see these differences. So you're going to put in this program. It's going to work with a trough or a box filament. Doesn't matter. It's going to pull in a long taper like this, as you see on the right-hand side. If your filament's too far to the left, you're going to have a taper that's longer on the left. If your filament's too far to the right, the pipettes on the right-hand side is going to be, the taper is going to be too long. See right here, the raised brass on the left is more present than the brass on the right-hand side. So you know this filament's too far to the right. That part of the glass is seeing more heat. The left-hand side is seeing more cooling. That's why you get that unevenness. Once that filament is perfectly centered over the air jet, you're going to get this on your face right here, and you're going to get exactly the same taper lengths on the right and left pipettes. That's what you want to aim for before you put any parameter settings in. The next thing you want to do is you want to make sure that glass is perfectly centered in the box or the trough filament. With the box filament, you want that glass right in the middle. If it's sitting too high up here, it's going to see too much heat. It's going to pull out unevenly. So you really want it perfectly centered right in the middle of that box filament. With a trough filament, you want it actually just sitting a little bit low. So here's your trough filament. You want it kind of low in the trough filament because you're not getting as much heat up here. So you got to have it sitting down a little lower. So here are the eccentric adjustments. There's a locking screw, and then there's the eccentric adjusting screw for moving filament block assembly up and down. And then again, here you're going to move the filament block assembly front to back to get it perfectly centered in your box filament, front to back here. That is very important. Then the parameter settings you find in the cookbook or that you know are stable, they were stable before you installed a new filament, it should work quite well for you. Another thing that this puller does is it loops. So what happens if you put in a one-line program with nothing on the second line, the glass won't separate in one stage. The puller will loop it back to the first line and read it over and over again. This is especially true when you have a very low velocity setting. And so your pull is 0, your velocity is low. And this is the best approach for making short tapered patch pipettes like that. How many loops do we have the puller go through when we're pulling a pipette? Well, this depends on if you have a box or trough filament and what size glass you have. Here's what happens when you loop, when you pull a pipette. If you pull it in 2 stages, looping twice, you get a gradual taper. And the more times you loop, the shorter that glass gets, and the larger the tip gets, and the lower the resistance is. So the more loops, shorter the taper, the larger the tip, the lower the resistance. And so you have these lower velocity settings here that allow it to loop more times, and you have the higher velocity settings that allow it to loop fewer times. So when you're making a patch pipette for wholesale recording or dissociated patch recording, you're going to want to use a program that loops 4 to 5 times, and you're going to use thick wall glass. And when you're using when you're doing slice patch recording, you're going to want to use thin wall glass to maintain the larger ID when you pull the glass out long, and you're going to want to loop 2 to 3 times. So it's the velocity setting that is determining how many times the puller loops. And you want to find a stable velocity setting, and you want to find the midpoint velocity. This is in page 30 and 31 in the Pipette Cookbook. This is extremely important. You want to find the value in the middle of the range that allows the puller to loop a certain number of times and use that value, and that's what's going to make your program stable. Then you're going to pull your pipettes and see what they look like, and then if you need to tweak the program and make the tip a little bit larger or smaller, you're going to do that by writing out the program and adjusting the programs on the last line, but we'll go over that again. The volume of glass is determined by this looping, and you want to make sure that you have the right volume of glass before the last stage of pulling so the tips turn out. So you actually have enough glass to pull a nice tip, a uniform pipette, and a nice tip and consistent results. Normally with thick wall glass, you're going to have 75 to 125 microns of glass before the last stage of pulling. And with thin wall glass, making the slice patch recording pipettes, you can have about 100 to 200 microns of glass there. Each division here is 2.5 microns. So You've got from 6 to 7 there on the scale. That's actually, this is at 10x. Sorry, you're at this is 100 microns right here. So that's something to look for. If we can go over that again at some point if you guys want to. So what's a good number of loops and a bad number of loops? With thick wall glass, you want to loop 4 to 5 times. With thin wall glass, traditionally you want to loop 2 to 3 times. So if you say you want to make a bigger pipette and you think, oh, I'm going to loop 6 or 7 times to get my pipette shorter and bigger, or I'm going to loop 4 to 5 times with that thin wall glass and get it shorter and bigger. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to go from pretty to pretty ugly. So you don't want that. You're going to get these cracked pipettes. You're going to get angled breaks. You're going to get splinters. It's going to be awful, and you're going to want to quit your job and go work at Starbucks. It's a good place to work, but you really don't want to do this. You need to not push yourself, push the glass, and you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing with the glass and pulling the pipettes out in a way that you have enough volume of glass left to make that final tip. So when you loop too many times, you use up the glass and you get these broken pipes. So when you adjust your settings, what you're going to do is you want to use that midpoint velocity for looping, say, 5 times for making your whole cell patch pipette. But say I want the tip to be a bit smaller and I want the resistance to be maybe another 4 or 5 megohms higher. I'm going to find the midpoint velocity for looping 4 times instead of 5. And by doing so, I'm going to go from 4 loops to 5 loops. I'm going to make that taper shorter. I'm going to make the taper longer and the tip a little bit smaller. And I can do the same with when I'm making slice patch recording pipettes. I'm going to increase the value there of the velocity from looping 3 times to looping twice, and I get a longer taper and a smaller tip. You can also write out your program. Say you don't want to change the taper length so much, you just want to adjust the tip size and just tweak the parameters a little bit to get that resistance a little bit, say, a little bit lower. So in this situation, what I've done is I've written out the program in the P1000, so I have my one-line program that loops 5 times. I'm having line 1 read 4 times and line 2 reading one time. So I've got my 5-line program, and on the last line, what I'm doing is I'm adjusting the heat, or I might adjust the velocity a little bit. So I'm dropping the heat so the glass separates a little cooler, and you go from maybe a 1 or 1.5 to 2 micron tip to something that might be a 2 to 2.5 to 3 micron tip by reducing the heat on that last line and making the tip separate a little bit cooler, and so the tip will be a little bit larger. This is a really good way to adjust your parameter settings. You don't want to adjust the settings on the previous lines because that's going to screw up how much glass you have available to make your tip. You can do the same thing with thin wall glass, where I go here, I've reduced the velocity on the second line, which is the line where the tip is forming, and I'm making a slightly shorter taper, but I really want to get that tip a little bit larger. I'm going from, say, 1.5 microns to 2 microns there. So with making sharp electrodes, in this situation, say you have a program from the cookbook, and you want to make your taper a little bit longer, and your tip smaller, and you want higher resistance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of pull first, and then I might add a little, might actually reduce some of the cooling and have the glass pull out where it's a little less viscous. And so I'm going to get a taper that's longer and a tip that's a little smaller. I can go even further, but I want to make small adjustments gradually. I want to make one change at a time. I do not want to make this change at the same time as I make this change, because what's going to happen, I'm going to get lost, and I'm not going to know what change was a good one and what was a bad one. It's the same way you would make your pipettes for microinjection. This is an example for pronuclear injection, where I've increased the pull a little bit, and I've decreased the cooling, so I'm pulling the tip a little bit longer and a little smaller. I can go even further there. A lot of times people, for pronuclear injection, they're tapping off the tip a little bit and breaking it back to make it a little bit, to open it up. But you want a nice gradual taper at the end, so when you break it back, it doesn't get big too fast, and you're not lysing your eggs. So if you adjust your parameter settings where you have a really high heat and you have really low cooling, This is a bad marriage. We want to avoid the bad marriage. Everyone's been in some sort of bad relationship before, and it's no fun. So this can happen with your glass, especially with thin wall glass. What happens is you've got your program here. Say you want something a little bit longer and smaller or higher resistance pipette. I jack up the heat. I reduce the cooling a lot. And I get this tube. I get this sticky kind of pipette. It looks like a miniature fly fishing rod or like a cat whisker. It's awful. And it's ugly and it's useless. You don't want to do this. What happens is I've increased the heat so much and I've dropped the cooling down so much that I'm pulling a stick. And I don't have enough cooling to actually reduce that glass and pull a nice sharp point. The cooling is very important here. And it's a very important feature to have on our pullers to make sure you can get a really nice small tip. You can pull the tips down to about 60 nanometers on our puller. So what I really want to do is I want to put in maybe a little bit more heat, and then I start adjusting the pull, and then I might start adjusting the delay a little bit. I'm going to get a smaller tip, a longer taper, a perfect and pretty pipette. And I get that little smiley face on my face. So the parameter settings, the ranges to work within are in the cookbook on page 77. Not sure why we buried it here in chapter 15 because it's pretty important. I might move it back up in the cookbook. And below this, you can see the parameter settings as you increase or decrease and what's going to happen to the glass. From that, I created a cheat sheet where I've given you the suggested units you can change the parameters within and what's going to happen to the glass if you increase or if you decrease the value and how the pipette's going to turn out. Variability is an issue that a lot of people run into, and this is most often due to the filament not being well aligned over that air jet. The glass is not well centered in the filament. You have unstable parameter settings. One parameter setting is way too high or way too low. I use an analogy of making carrot soup, even though I really don't like carrot soup and I've never made it before in my life. But you're making carrot soup and you have your carrots, your salt, your chicken broth, your cream, your parsley, onions, and you're making your soup and you put it in the blender and you taste it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is awful. And you get this awful expression on your face and you realize you've put in way too much salt. Then you start running around changing all the other ingredients. You start adding the onions and you add more carrots and you add more chicken broth, and all of a sudden it's awful. You can't fix it because there's just way too much salt. You can't take the salt out. So you got to dump it down the sink and start over. Well, when you're making a pipette, it's kind of the same thing. You don't want one ingredient to be way too high or way too low. It's going to throw off everything, and no matter what you do, say you have the heat, you've put in 40 units of heat over the ramp test value. You have way too much heat no matter what you do with the time, with the cooling, with the velocity, with the pull. No matter what, it's still overwhelmed and you're getting those ugly sticky pipettes, and they all look like fly fishing rods. So you want to make sure that you don't have one parameter way too high or way too low, and it's going to just throw off everything. So the other thing you're going to run into is you're going to run into instability if you have the puller looping too many times and making those pretty ugly pipettes. You're not using the midpoint velocity, and you might not be using the ideal glass and filament combination. So you got to go to that cookbook or call me here at Sutter, and we'll give you some help. The dry rite is also something else. You want to make sure that it's at least you have still some blue granules left that is still desiccating the air. The humidity can introduce some variability. You can also have an older puller that's got some mechanical issues, so that's something we can go over the phone or email. You can send me some pictures of the puller, and we can discuss that and see what might be going on. So to review here the do's and don'ts, please run a ramp test. Don't guess at the heat. Center that filament over the air jet. That's super important. Make sure you've established the midpoint velocity when you're making this patch pipettes. When you're making the sharp electrodes, please do avoid that bad marriage of high heat, low cooling. Read that manual and cookbook. If you have insomnia, take them home, read them in bed. They'll quickly put you to sleep, I promise you. And then please call Sutter for help. Don't wait, and don't put that off. We're available. You get a person when you call here, and they'll connect you to the right technical support staff to help you out. The things that you don't want to do is install a random heat setting and burn out your filament. You don't want to guess at that midpoint velocity. You don't want to loop too many times getting those ugly pipettes. Don't adjust too many values at the same time. I do this all the time because I'm super impatient and I just throw in a boatload of changes, and I just want to get that pipette right away, and I get lost. And you want to avoid doing that. One change at a time. Supposedly we're all scientists. You got to approach this as a scientific experiment where there's one variable at a time, and you're just adjusting one variable at a time to see what happens to the glass. Approach it like a scientist. And again, don't give up. Before you quit your job and go work out as a barista at Starbucks, don't give up. Give us a call. We'll help you out. We'll hopefully get you back on the right track. Here we are right there. Call us. And here is at the bottom our phone number, my email address, and I might regret this, but I'm giving out my mobile cell phone number for everybody to use. I travel a bit, so you guys can use this too. All right, that's it for me, and I'm going to turn this over to Jan and to Telly if there's any questions to answer.
Thank you very much, Adair. I think there's plenty of questions to answer. Thank you very much for this nice talk. I definitely like your example about the carrot soup. I will stop putting too much salt on my pipettes once I figured out how to clamp those carrots. Yeah, it looks like there's enough questions to fill another 2.5 hours. We will not do that, put everybody to sleep. Let me reiterate, all questions that we do not get to today will be addressed by email. But let me turn this over to Telly, who will moderate the Q&A session and present a number of questions that we think are of common relevance, common interest. Telly, it's all yours.
Okay. And Jan, one more thing. Will my monitor still be live so I can bring up other slides if I need to?
Yes, we will leave you the presenter, and as long as your computer doesn't go to sleep, you'll be live.
Got it.
Okay. Telly?
As long as I don't go to sleep.
All right.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Adair. As Jan mentioned, yes, we do have a number of questions that you need to address. So let's get started with the following. Can the width of a filament affect the wall thickness of a pulled pipette tip?
The answer is no. The OD and ID of your glass remains the same as it's pulled all the way to the tip. So if you start off with 1 millimeter glass that has a 0.5 millimeter ID, and you pull it down to make a 0.5 micron tip, the OD is going to be 1 micron. The ID-OD ratio remains the same. If you're using a laser puller and you're pulling quartz, you can flip the glass over itself and thin it out. That is a nice advantage of using a P1000 puller in quartz glass. You can get the tips extremely fine.
P2000.
So the answer is no, you cannot thicken that glass or thin it.
Okay, here's another one for you. Is it predictable to loop one time but get good-looking pipettes for thin-wall glass?
Well, it kind of depends on the application. When I talk about looping, it means that you are cycling and reading the program over and over again. If you're pulling a pipette in one stage, it is one loop, but you're pulling in one stage. And if you're making a microinjection pipette or a sharp electrode, that's what you want to aim for. If you're making a patch pipette that's usually short and stubby and it's got low resistance, a one-stage pull is I've never heard of it before. Maybe someone's out there is doing it. It's probably pretty rare because that tip's going to reduce and become smaller than 1 micron, which is pretty small. And normally if you need a really small patch pipette, you're going to use thick-walled glass and maybe loop 3 times to get a small tip like that, but you still have a short taper. So it depends on the application.
Thank you for that. Here we go. I have a P1000 puller and usually have to wait for the draw temperature to fall back to around 23 degrees Celsius. Do you recommend using the temperature around 45 to 60 degrees for pulls?
Well, usually when you're pulling your pipettes and you're designing your program, the jaws get warm, and they warm up to around 45, 55, 65 degrees Celsius. And when you design your program and you find that midpoint velocity, you've pulled maybe 10, 20 pipettes, once you start using your pipettes, the jaws are pretty hot, and so that residual heat in the jaws is sometimes a key factor to making sure your pipettes are turning out okay. So what some people do is they'll heat up their jaws in the morning or in the afternoon, wherever they get to work, and they'll heat up the jaws. They'll maybe pull 2 or 3 pipettes and get them hot, get the jaws hot before they start making their pipettes, because when they designed their program, the jaws were hot and that residual heat was available. So what I'll do is I'll even put a rubber band around the knobs of the puller bars without glass installed. I'll press pull, the heat will turn on, and it'll sit there, and the heat will be on for a minute and a half, and it'll error out, and you'll get an error message on the display. But by doing so, with the heat staying on for a minute and a half, you're going to heat those jaws up to about 55, 65 degrees Celsius, and then you'll be pulling your pipettes when the jaws are warm. And most of the time, the jaws are warm when you're pulling your pipettes. So it's good to optimize your program around hot jaws rather than around cold jaws. And the newer puller has a preheat mode where you can actually preheat the P1000 puller. You can preheat the jaws to 70 degrees Celsius and pull your pipettes all at the same temperature. So if you want to preheat the jaws on the P87 or P97, put a rubber band around the puller bar knobs. Don't let anyone freak out about it. You're not going to melt down the puller. It's just going to heat up the filament for about a minute and a half and get things warm. I hope that answers that question.
I think it does. So here's another one. What causes soot on the filament, and is there anything that can be done to minimize it?
Okay, so when you install a new filament, the platinum iridium filament, normally you're going to see a little bit more of this soot or this carbon deposit or this sputter coating of platinum on the shoulder or the taper of the glass. And it only shows up there, and what happens is that platinum is just kind of sputtering out the metals, and it gets incorporated into the shoulder of the taper, but you don't see it at the tip. It gets incorporated into the glass. It's inert. It doesn't leach out. It doesn't poison your cells. It doesn't cause any problems, and it's really something you can pretty much ignore, and it's not an issue. But if you're using heat setting way too low, you might be cooking the glass and causing that darkness on the shoulder to be a little bit more extreme, or you might be slapping your glass with a whole boatload of heat, and maybe you're causing the filament to get overly hot, and you're actually kind of charring the glass a little bit, or like spitting out a little bit more platinum and getting the shoulder of that taper pretty dark. So it's a good thing to check and see if your heat settings are okay, and if you're near the ramp test value, and your heat on time when you're pulling your pipettes is somewhere between maybe 6 to 10 seconds pulling a sharp electrode, and maybe about like 15 to 25 seconds when you're pulling a patch pipette. So that darkness on the shoulder of the taper of the pipette is nothing to worry about.
Great. What is the largest consistent tip opening that can be obtained for a patch pipette without manually breaking the tip? And
okay.
Follow-up, what are the basic parameters to obtain large tip sizes?
Say the follow-up again.
What are basic parameters to obtain large tip sizes? Okay.
So you can loop about sometimes even 6 times with the thick-walled glass to pull a larger patch pipette, but you're going to introduce some more variability because you're really at the threshold of having a sufficient amount of glass before the last stage of pulling to actually make a good tip. You're going to go from those pretty pipettes to those pretty ugly pipettes, and you don't want to do that if you loop too many times. So here, I'll show that to you again. Right there. So what I prefer to do is write the program out into multiple lines, reduce the heat on that last line to make the tip a little bit larger, and to make maybe the taper a little bit shorter. But one other thing I've run into, I was out in Hawaii, not on vacation, I was actually working, and I was in a lab, and I was introduced to this glass 1.65 by 1.2, and let me see if I can find that file here. I'm making larger patch pipettes. moment. Here. So I like using this glass so I can actually loop maybe 3, 4, or 5 times. And because I've started off with a glass that has a larger ID, and I can also use maybe 2mm glass with 1.56 ID. But this glass, I really like this glass. And I can loop about 3 or 4 times, and I can get a 3, 4, 5 micron tip and a really nice low resistance down at maybe 1 or even under 1 mega ohm. And it seems to work really well with a 2.5 by 2.5 box filament. And this is something you might want to consider using. You're going to have to change the gasket in your head stage to allow to accommodate this larger OD of glass right here. But if you really need a large patch pipette, you're going to want to use that 1.65 or that 2mm by 1.56 somewhat thin-walled larger glass. That's the
Very well.
Okay.
Just again, another loop question. We have a program that pulls an inconsistent number of loops. Is there a way to prevent this?
Yes. You want to go to page 30 or 31 in your Pipette Cookbook, and you want to find that midpoint velocity. And what you really want to do is you want to go through all the parameter settings that allow the puller to loop, say, 5 times, and you go higher and higher in the velocities till the puller loops 4 times. You go lower and lower until the puller loops 6 times, so that you have the entire range that loops 5 times. You pick a value in the middle, and that's going to be stable, and that's what that's your foundation of your program. So then if you write it out, and you write it out into 5 lines, you start adjusting the parameter settings on the last line only. Hopefully you won't run into any problems. Now, if you've done this and it's still not working, make sure that filament's well centered over the air jet right to left. Make sure the glass is well centered in the filament from top to bottom and front to back. And make sure that you're using that midpoint velocity. If still all things are not working well, you might have some mechanical issues. You might want to check to see if the pulleys, the right and left pulleys, the wheels where the cables wrap around the cables wrap around these wheels on the right and left of the puller. You want to make sure those roll smoothly, and you spin them, and they hopefully turn around a number of times before they stop. So you could have some mechanical issues if you're running into a boatload of variability and you've already gone through all the steps that have been recommended. And in that situation, you can send the puller back to Sutter, and we can repair it or refurbish it. We do have this service where we can rebuild a puller and make it like new if it's a P97 or a P1000, and that will extend the life of your puller. You might want to consider this with the P97s because we are still making that puller, and we still have the parts, but eventually we'll be making the P1000 and then the next version puller, so it's good to jump on the opportunity to refurbish your P97 if it's over 10, 15, or 20 years old.
So we have gone for a full hour now, but on one hand, questions are still coming in. On the other hand, very few people have left the webinar. So I would suggest we go for another 2 or 3 questions and then address the rest by email, but we will still leave the session open for a little while for people to ask further questions. Does that work for everybody?
Sounds good.
Okay, there's a lot more questions to go through, so sure. Let's go to the next one. Do you have any tips for producing parallel tips for ICSI injection pipettes to prevent the sperm sticking to the inside after manufacture?
Okay. To make a long tapered pipette with parallel walls, it's best to use a 2.5 by 4.5 box filament. That filament is in your spare container. You might have that already installed in the puller. That's a very traditional filament to use. It's FB254B. That's the filament part number. It's 4.5 millimeters wide, and it pulls a very long, gradual taper. You want to use a microforge and break it back to about 5, 6, or 7 microns ID. That's the traditional size of a sperm head, and then you normally will bevel that pipette, and then you'll put a spike on it. Now, when you're putting a spike on the pipette, you're kind of putting a little splinter of a sword of glass on the tip of the pipette. And when you do that, you're using your microforge and you're kind of heating up the tip and yanking the pipette away from the heated filament. You're making this little spike of glass on the end. If your heat's too high, you're going to melt that glass down a little bit, and the sperm are more likely to stick to the tip of the pipette. Some glass is treated, it's salinized, and that's maybe an option to do. And I guess some other things you can do is look at the solutions you're using and make sure that those aren't causing more problems with stickiness and affecting the glass tip and how the sperm is behaving within the pipette.
Okay, so here's another one. Does humidity greatly affect the consistency of the needles? If so, what can you suggest to control this problem?
Okay, so the P87 has a dry-rite canister. The dry-rite canister is right here, and that dries out the air, and that air is delivered into the humidity control chamber for your P97. Your P87 doesn't have this chamber, but it does have the dry-rite canister. What you want to do if you want to if you want to control for the humidity, basically what's happening is the humidity is causing the cooling of the glass to be variable. When you have moisture, say you're sweating, you're accelerating your cooling rate. And that happens on the glass, around the glass too. If there's moisture around, it's going to change the rate of cooling of the glass. And so that's the reason we have this humidity control chamber, and this gets purged with dry air before and after the pull. If you want to counter that humidity, that might be, it's the summer and you're in Japan, you're in Hawaii, and you've got a lot of humidity you're dealing with, you're in Texas, Louisiana. You want to maybe increase the air time before the pull to go from 5 seconds to maybe 10 or 15 seconds. And another thing that's going on when you are, when there's humidity is you are also changing how the tip, what's happening at the tip of the pipette. You get these hydroxyl ions that form when there's moisture around, and the tip it changes the composition at that tip, and it becomes more basic. And the cells don't like that. And so you might, when you're making a patch pipette, you might run into problems with sealing. The cells just don't like that tip because it's far too basic, because it was made in a situation where it was pretty humid. A lot of people ran into problems in the past before we had this humidity control chamber, where in the summer they couldn't do certain experiments because it was too humid, so they just went off and did something else. And once it was nice and dry, they started making their patch pipettes and recording. So hopefully that humidity control chamber does control for that. And here's a book called Properties of Glass Forming Melts, basically describing what's happening with glass when you're forming it and when it's cooling off, and some of the chemical reactions that are going on when there's moisture around. This is just another thing to kind of think about when you're making your pipettes, and avoiding humidity is a very good idea. That dry-rite canister needs to be replenished with blue dry granules. There's a video we have online for how to replace the dry-rite. If you have still a little bit of blue in your dry-rite canister, you're good to go. Don't worry about it. But if it's all pink or it's all lavender, it's saturated with moisture, and you're going to run into some variability. Maybe not as much as if your filament's not aligned over your air jet, or your glass isn't perfectly aligned within the filament, but it will introduce some issues if you have humidity in many cases.
Okay, great. Well, let's see. Here's one. What causes bending in the pipette? In their example, they have the left one is bent down and the right side is bent up.
Oh, that's not good. So, if that's happening, it means that it's possible that the puller bars, the right and left puller bars, are either bent or the panels are somewhat offset. These puller bars here are aligned. They're straightened, and they're straight within about 12.5 microns straight from front to back. and this puller bar has to be perfectly aligned with this puller bar. So if it's offset, you end up pulling the glass and you end up pulling it kind of like this. And so you end up where, I don't know if it's really necessarily bending, it might be kind of off center to the shaft of the glass. It might be eccentric rather than bending. If it's actually bending, you might have some issue here in the clamps where the rubber padding's lapping over, or the rubber padding's missing, or you have a little burr in the metal. What you should do is probably send some images of the glass, how it's installed in the puller bars. And another thing you can do, this is kind of helpful, if you put a piece of glass in this puller bar and you have it poking out about this far, I hope you guys can see this, and you put another piece of glass in this one, you have it going all the way through to the other side, you can look here and see if the glass is aligned perfectly. You want to make sure that both pieces of glass are perfectly aligned here when you look at them at the horizon and when you look at them from top, looking straight down. If they're not aligned perfectly, there could be an issue with the puller bars being bent or the panels here being offset somehow. So it's a very hard thing to describe and how to fix via phone. I've done it a few times. It's pretty difficult. Usually it's good to get that puller in and we can get it set up and put back to factory specifications and send it back to you repaired and tuned up and polished.
A good diagnostic tool for this might also be the video on our YouTube channel, checking the puller bars, because it's entirely possible that somebody tried adjusting the V-groove bearings.
One person said they're using, they would like to know what the advantages and disadvantages are between the different filaments, basically between the box and the trough filaments, and in particular for sharp electrodes.
The box filament heats the glass on all four sides, and as a result of heating the glass evenly on all four sides, it collapses faster and you're better able to control the taper length of the pipette. Trough filaments tend to pull the glass out longer, and it's a little bit more gradual. And so if you want a really, really long, sharp electrode, you can use a box filament, but usually it's too flimsy and too weak to actually penetrate the cells or the tissue. So I tend to prefer a box filament for pretty much all applications. One of the only applications I might think of the trough filament being an advantage is when you're making pipettes for mass spectrometry, and you need a little bit more of a gradual cone-angled short pipette.
Now I have a couple of P2000 questions that hopefully you can address. So I guess there was a question regarding the cookbook and the P2000. So I know that we do not have a cookbook available, but they would like to know if some of the considerations, some of the ideas do follow across the puller lines.
Jan, you want to answer that?
Yes. For example, the heat. Changes in the heat have the same consequence on the tip shape. Higher heat, smaller tip, lower heat, bigger tip. From the starting point, the velocity, for example, even though the actual values, the absolute values are somewhat different, but it's the same things. The velocities, the higher velocity causes a longer taper, and that's the same across all pullers. The same for the pull. A hard pull will give you a longer taper and a smaller tip. The only difference on the P2000 is if you use quartz, then you will also need a pull for patch pipettes. So even for relatively short pipettes, you will need to dial in a pull.
And Jan, I think you've developed a nice catalog of parameter settings to help people get started with, depending on what their application is and what the glasses they're using. It's something that we hope to create for the P2000 eventually, but it functions a little differently, so we're still working on that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. Well, here's another one for you, Adair. We experience variability over time, and pipettes pulled later at higher jaw temperatures have naturally smaller tips. We thought that using the safe heat value would help, but in our P1000, it's grayed out and we cannot turn it on. What are we missing?
It might be, the program might be locked and you can't access the preheat mode. That's if you can actually see the wording there, and there is a preheat mode that you can see and it's grayed out, I'd imagine the program's locked, so you can unlock the program and then activate the preheat mode.
Can you tell us how to unlock it? Or does that require going back into the PowerPoint?
Well, as I recall, you go to the menu, you go into the program, and then you go into the menu of that program, and there's an option for locking and unlocking the program. And so that is in the menu within the program that you do that. And you can just unlock and lock that specific program. It doesn't lock all the programs and the whole puller. So it's in the menu section that you do that.
All right. How about this one? How often do you perform a ramp test?
That is a good question. And I will perform a ramp test when I open a new box of glass in case the wall thickness has shifted a little bit with that new run of glass. I will also run a new ramp test when I put in a new filament. And the other times I'll run a ramp test or maybe at the beginning of each week. And then if I'm a little worried about maybe some new person in the lab who might be running into filament or isn't sure what they're doing and I have a little paranoia, I might run that ramp test a little bit more often. If I see that the filament looks kind of funky and someone's had a collision with it, with the glass, I will also run a ramp test to see if the heating characteristics have shifted as a result.
So here, Adair, on average, how much should we expect to adjust the heat to get a change in tip size? This is on a P97.
Well, it kind of depends on if you're pulling a patch pipette or if you're pulling a sharp electrode. I normally like to leave the heat alone. Use the ramp test value and just leave it at that, because when you change the heat setting, it's a big change. Again, it's like throwing another log in the fire, and all of a sudden you just have this huge shift. And in that situation, it's kind of like the salt in the carrot soup. You can't adjust for that. You can't control for that heat, and it's overwhelming the glass. So I like to leave the heat alone in most situations. Maybe I'll increase the heat, maybe 5 or 10 units to get a smaller tip. Most of the time, I might go maybe 5 or 10 units, and then I'll leave it at that, and then I'll start increasing the pull. And I might reduce the cooling a little bit. But again, if you go too far, if you go too low in the cooling, you're going to run into those ugly pipettes, those ugly little sticky pipettes where you're making a tube and you're not making a tip. So right here is the tube if you have increased the heat too much and if you have reduced the cooling too much. So I like to adjust the pull and also the cooling in small units, increments, and that's, again, shown in the cheat sheet here, and this can be provided on our website, and we can send it to people. If you're making a patch pipette and you want to make the tip a little smaller, you want to make that change of heat or the change in cooling, or actually not the cooling, but the change in heat or the change in velocity on the last line when the tip is forming, not before, because if you do it before, you're going to change the volume of glass that you have available to make the tip, and then you're going to have all these screwy results. You're not going to be able to follow what's happening. So you really want to make the change when the tip is forming, and that would be on the last line of the program. So you say you have a one-line program, loops 3 times, write it out into 3 lines, adjust the heat or maybe the pull a little bit or the velocity to get the tip a little bit smaller or a little bit larger without changing that taper length.
All right, this is our last question. We have a lot more to answer, but of course we're going to be running out of time. So this is the last one for live audience, and then the rest will be answered by email, as Jan mentioned. So this is also regarding a P97. I found that after I pulled a few pipettes, the total pulling time is becoming shorter and shorter, and the pipette tips may be becoming longer. but after I give the puller a break, the total pulling time returns to normal. Is this normal, or do I need to change the filament?
Well, I don't think it has to do with the filament. I think it has to do with the parameter settings being unstable. And basically what's happening is you probably have a little bit too much glass sitting in the taper, as just shown here. Basically, the amount of glass here, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to move that. The amount of glass here in the center where the glass is necked down is shifting. And so as the jaws get hotter, it's transferring the residual heat in the jaws to the glass, and that's allowing the glass to get smaller and smaller and pull higher resistant needles or smaller pipettes. So basically what you want to do in this situation is write your program so it's stable in hot conditions. And that would be the best advice. I mean, it's hard to struggle with pulling your pipettes when it's cool all the time. So the best thing to do is to write your program so it's happy when the jaws are hot. And that's what I would aim for.
Thank you very much. Well, with that, I turn it over to Jan. Thank you, Adair.
Thank you very much to both Adair and Telly, and thank you very much for the audience for being here in such a big number. And even during the Q&A session, very few have left. As I said, we will leave this session open for another 5 or 10 minutes. We will stop the broadcasting, so you will not see our slides anymore, but you have a chance to finish any questions that you might be typing right now. With the morning webinar, the session 1 and the session 2 combined, it will probably take us more than a week or two to get back to everybody, but we do promise we will address all questions that were asked here. If you leave the webinar, a survey will pop up. Please give us your feedback. Please let us know whether the timing worked, how you liked the webinar overall, whether the product overview in the beginning was something valuable for you, or whether we should rather skip it the next time. Things like that. That feedback is very important to us. Thank you very much again for being here, and you have a great evening or a great day, depending on where in the world you are. Thank you much.